Opening the center instantly creates dynamic attacking chances and invites immediate piece development. Preparing to challenge the center. This pawn unlocks defenders for a flexible setup, though it slightly hinders the queen's immediate development. Immediately staking a claim in the center. White aims to build a powerful pawn phalanx and restrict black's pieces. Immediately challenging the center with d5 establishes central tension and opens lines for black's pieces. Securing the center with the knight reinforces white's pawn structure, eyeing potential attacking avenues. Developing the knight to its natural outpost. This move prepares for rapid central pawn breaks and reinforces the king's defense. Challenging black's knight. This pawn thrust aggressively claims central territory and restricts enemy piece mobility. Retreating the knight to d7 prepares its redeployment to f6, reinforcing the center and entangling black's pieces. Consolidating kingside space with f4 aims to lock down black's knight and prepare a potential pawn storm or central expansion. Launching a central pawn thrust. Black immediately challenges white's pawn chain and aims to liberate their pieces. Bolstering the central pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. This knight development elegantly supports the f4 pawn and prepares to contest the center. This knight's arrival on c6 solidifies black's central pawn chain while preparing for further development and offering a potential avenue to challenge white's advanced e5 pawn. Developing this bishop to e3 prepares for kingside castling, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure and potentially eyeing weakened squares. On black's queenside, relinquishing central pawn control so readily invites white's pieces to flood the position. Black must now be acutely aware of the potential for rapid development and a dangerous kingside initiative, particularly with the f-pawn already advanced. Instantly liberating the d-file. This recapture aims to seize central influence and prepare for aggressive pawn thrusts, potentially cramping black's development and creating isolated pawn weaknesses later. Liberating that bishop from its pawn cage immediately exerts pressure on the knight. A clever piece of geometry that hints at immediate tactical possibilities or a subtle positional squeeze. The queen swiftly joins the fray, preparing a potential kingside attack while also reinforcing the pawn on e5. Consider how this centralizes a powerful piece, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure and creating immediate pressure. It's a dynamic positioning that demands careful calculation from black. Securing the monarch offers immediate psychological comfort, freeing the pieces to engage in the burgeoning central conflict and opening pathways for future counterplay along the now liberated kingside. Embracing the initiative. White initiates a daring kingside castling that immediately injects dynamism into the position by creating a formidable battery of queen and rook pointed directly at black's vulnerable monarch. A bold commitment to aggressive play and an invitation for tactical fireworks. Probing the queenside. 10. A6 subtly prepares to expand, potentially utilizing the b5 square to challenge white's advanced pawn and create counterplay, while also preventing any immediate knight incursions to that critical outpost. Reorienting the knight towards the kingside. This maneuver seeks to reinforce the central pawn structure and potentially launch an attack against black's castled king, even as it surrenders control of the d4 square and opens a diagonal for the white queen. Embracing the queenside. Black maneuvers the knight with tempo, challenging white's central pawn thrust and hinting at a future queenside expansion by targeting the d4 square. Positioning the knight centrally on g3 aims to reinforce the kingside attack and prepare for potential pawn pushes like f5. adding pressure to black's queenside development and creating a strong pawn chain. Black expands on the queenside, creating immediate tension and challenging white's pawn chain, aiming to disrupt white's central control and prepare for further queenside activity. Securing the queenside flank with this pawn advance prevents black's knight from exploiting the now exposed b-pawn and aims to establish a stable defensive structure. Although it concedes some central space and could potentially weaken the light squares later if not supported carefully. Unveiling the dark squared bishop to its most active diagonal, this maneuver seeks to harness the power of the long range and pressure the f2 pawn, a potential weakness in white's castled king's defenses, while also supporting the central pawn structure. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, especially when the queenside pawn storm begins to brew. This proactive repositioning addresses potential checks or discovered attacks down the c-file and prepares for a more serene development of white's remaining pieces without the king being a constant target. Gaining the open c-file for rook activity, black reinforces its presence on the queenside, preparing for further expansion or potentially a direct assault on white's castled king. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, white aims to exploit the space advantage gained with the pawn on e5 and open lines towards black's relatively exposed monarch. A daring repositioning, the knight boldly ventures into a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay on the queenside. Navigating a crowded queenside, this knight repositioning aims to find a more active role, perhaps supporting a central advance or defending key squares from the encroaching black pieces. The idea is to eventually bring this knight to g3 or even f5 to create threats. Shifting the queen to e7 aims to reinforce the e6 pawn and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the king's side, while also offering a way for the queen to potentially retreat if the queenside pressure mounts. Sacrificing the bishop pair to disrupt black's central pawn structure opens up avenues for white's knight, potentially establishing it on a strong outpost while simultaneously eliminating a well-placed defender of black's king. The doubled pawns on the c-file are now a tangible target, forcing black to consider how to manage this potential weakness while simultaneously activating the rook on the semi-open file. Initiating a dramatic reshuffling of the knight, white repositions to contest the d-file and potentially launch a kingside pawn storm, while simultaneously freeing the f3 square for his other knight, aiming to create more pressure against black's castled position. Refortifying the rook's presence on the 7th rank, this maneuver seeks to solidify the pawn structure and maintain active piece play against white's growing central influence, aiming to deny the opponent any immediate breakthroughs while preparing for potential counterplay. On the queenside, reclaiming the center and preparing a central pawn push, white aims to disrupt black's queenside expansion by repositioning the bishop to a more active square. The bishop repositions to a diagonal that directly pressures white's central pawns, creating a subtle but potent threat of forks and exchanges, forcing white to consider its safety and potentially disrupting its current pawn structure. Focusing on the powerful central pawn on e5 and the potential for white to exploit the weakened queenside light squares. This queen repositioning aims to secure that advanced pawn and prepare for potential queenside expansion while also keeping an eye on black's potential counterplay on the d-file. Unleashing a knight to c5 injects dynamism, challenging the entrenched white bishop and potentially disrupting the coordination of white's queenside pieces. This maneuver seeks to exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's pawn structure, particularly the d4 square, by offering concrete counterplay and forcing white to address the immediate tactical threats. The knight's new outpost could become a formidable attacking platform, steering the game towards more complex and dynamic positions. Initiating a daring pawn storm. White bravely throws the f-pawn forward, aiming to fracture black's queenside structure and potentially pry open lines towards the enemy king. This aggressive thrust injects immediate dynamism into the position, forcing black to confront the escalating threats or risk falling behind in development and space. The black bishop, having retreated to c3, now sets up a fascinating tension, directly challenging the advanced white pawn on e5 and simultaneously eyeing the vulnerable dark squares around the white king. This maneuver is not just about piece activity. It's a geometric statement, creating a dynamic blockage that forces white to reckon with immediate threats and potential tactical rearrangements on the queenside. Unleashing a pawn storm. White sacrifices material to rip open lines towards black's vulnerable monarch, creating immediate tactical headaches and forcing a re-evaluation of black's defensive setup. Embracing the broken pawn structure opens up attacking avenues for white's queen and rook while sacrificing structural integrity for piece activity. The pawn sacrifice on h7 initiates a ferocious assault, sacrificing material for a decisive king hunt. Sacrificing the bishop to expose the black monarch is a bold maneuver, aiming to exploit the open diagonals and files now available for white's attacking pieces. This move disrupts black's defensive setup and forces an immediate, uncomfortable reaction, potentially leading to a forced sequence of exchanges that favors white's initiative and opens critical lines towards the king's shelter. The king's newly revealed vulnerability becomes the central focus of white's strategy, shifting the game into a sharp tactical battleground where precision and calculation are paramount. Opening the king's sanctuary with such a pawn sacrifice, though seemingly aggressive, now forces a desperate defense. Black must meticulously coordinate piece activity to blunt the onslaught and avoid the impending king hunt. Unleashing a breathtaking queen sacrifice. This audacious check rips open the king's defenses, forcing a desperate situation for black and potentially initiating a swift, decisive attack. The king's flight towards the queenside, though seemingly desperate, introduces a new dimension of geometrical pressure, forcing a re-evaluation of the open h-file's dominance. Exploiting the king's exposed position becomes the paramount concern following this brilliant sacrifice. The king's desperate scramble for safety amidst the attacking storm highlights the precariousness of black's position, forcing him to constantly seek refuge from white's relentless queen and bishop battery. A calculated attempt to exploit the weakened kingside by luring the black queen further from its defense. Black's king, now starkly exposed on the dark squares, immediately seeks refuge behind a retreating rook, a desperate repositioning aimed at stifling the dangerous diagonal assault that threatens immediate disaster. Unleashing a powerful bishop sacrifice. White initiates a dramatic confrontation, aiming to shatter black's defenses around the king with a relentless barrage of pieces. A desperate attempt to escape the immediate mating net, but the queen's repositioning leaves the king exposed to further assault and neglects critical central control. Unleashing a sudden check, white forces the black king out into the open, intensifying the pressure along the weakened dark squares and demanding immediate attention from black's remaining pieces. The queen's reluctant retreat to guard the monarch, while seemingly passive, sets a delicate trap, inviting the bishop to trespass and potentially severing the crucial diagonal. The king's reign has ended in a forceful exchange, simplifying the board and ushering in a sharp, forcing sequence. This decisive pawn sacrifice rips open the defenses, creating unavoidable threats that will dominate the remainder of the game. The resulting open lines demand immediate and precise calculation from both sides as the advantage shifts dramatically. Black's king is now exposed, a stark consequence of the preceding exchanges, and the immediate future promises a desperate defensive struggle against White's remaining pieces. The bishop's sacrifice now rips open the king's defenses, creating immediate, inescapable threats. Emerging from a whirlwind of sacrifices, Black seeks to reintegrate their remaining knight, aiming to contest the now open central files and potentially create counterplay against White's potentially exposed king. This rook now claims the open file, initiating a potential pressure campaign down the h-file against Black's somewhat exposed king, while simultaneously preparing to swing over to the queenside if needed. The initiative shifts dramatically as the knight crashes into the king's defenses, threatening a devastating discovery and exposing White's monarch to renewed danger after the rook sacrifice. Seizing the initiative with a daring exchange, White dramatically simplifies the board, hoping to convert the material advantage into a winning endgame. Retrieving the piece from d2 restores material equality, but the immediate cost is the loss of valuable development time, leaving Black's king potentially exposed to White's centralized pieces and the open g-file. A stark contrast to the earlier complex maneuvering for positional advantage. A desperate attempt to create attacking illusions on the kingside, but it neglects the open central files and the exposed nature of White's own monarch. The current board state demands a radical reevaluation of piece placement, prioritizing active squares for the knights, especially the one now eyeing the pawn chain on the kingside, becomes paramount over simply recapturing material. Reclaiming the d-file now establishes a critical central presence for the rook, aiming to liberate the pawn on d2 and prevent Black's king from finding respite via that open channel. The Black king, now exposed on the kingside after a series of daring sacrifices, finds itself in a precarious situation. Actively seeking a refuge by advancing towards the center might be a risky gambit, as the remaining white pieces are well positioned to exploit any kingly missteps and capitalize on the open lines. Reclaiming the central file becomes paramount as the rook embarks on a mission to dominate the open d-file and prepare for potential piece exchanges that could lead to a more active endgame. The bishop retreats, a temporary safety found, but the fundamental issue of White's rooks dominating the central files remains unresolved, potentially leading to a queenside unraveling if Black cannot generate sufficient counterplay against White's robust pawn structure. Bringing the monarch to the center of the action, White now prepares to support the rook's advancement, aiming to exploit the now open d-file for potential pressure against Black's rook and pawn structure. A bold pawn thrust, aiming to pry open lines on the queenside and potentially disrupt White's consolidating king position, though it weakens the pawn chain's integrity. Initiating the king's trek towards the queenside, seeking a safer haven from the remaining artillery and potential pawn advances, while simultaneously preparing to support the rook's repositioning. A desperate gambit emerges from Black, sacrificing the rook for a fleeting moment of activity, but it offers no real hope of stemming White's overwhelming material and positional advantage. The king remains exposed, and White's remaining pieces are poised to exploit the open lines, rendering this attempt ultimately futile. The white rook's sacrifice across the rank forcefully aims to dismantle Black's pawn shield and expose the king's sanctuary, a daring gambit for an endgame advantage. The pawn structure crumbles, leaving the Black king acutely vulnerable with the open files now a terrifying prospect for Black's Remaining pieces. The king's newfound freedom on e2 promises an aggressive endgame push, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch and control the center with active piece play. Finally resolving the central pawn mass. Black seeks to simplify the ensuing endgame, though this exchange might give white a slight edge in pawn structure and space on the kingside due to the doubled c pawns that will result.